I have to thank the Museum Africa for hosting us here today. And also I have to thank the museum curator, Zola Msiza of the Museum Africa, and all the partners who have made the exhibition, Rise and Fall of Apartheid, Photography and the Bureaucracy of Everyday Life possible. But of course, the evening here today is about two thinkers, two creatives, one known more for her writing and the other known more perhaps for his writing with light. You know, photography is about writing with light. As a way of introducing them, maybe I should give you a bit of snippet of who they are in case you were under some rock and you do not know them. I get the mic, I get away with all this nonsense. David Goldblatt was born in 1930 in South Africa, and since the 1960s he has devoted all his time to photography. In 1989, Goldblatt founded the Market Photo Workshop in Johannesburg. In 1998, he was the first South African to be given a solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In 2001, a retrospective of his work, David Goldblatt, I need to pronounce it right, David Goldblatt.
Just David.
Yeah, I can say just David. Yeah. 51 years began a tour of galleries and museums. He was one of South African artists at the exhibit at Documenta 11 in 2002 and Documenta 12 in 2007 in Kassel, Germany. He has held solo exhibitions at the Jewish Museum and the New Museum, both in New York. His work was included in the exhibition ILLUMInations at the 54th Venice Biennale in 2011 and has featured on shows at San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and the Barbican Centre in London. He has published several books of his works. I mean, I think you can go into any photography bookshop and you're certain to find a few of good David's books there. And I mean, he's sort of the standard by which all photographers live in South Africa. I know he probably is modest and would not take to such grand descriptions. And then of course there is the lady on the other side, Neelika Jayawardane, who is Associate Professor of English at the State University of New York in Oswego. She was born in Sri Lanka and grew up in the Copperbelt province of Zambia. She completed her PhD at the University of Denver, Colorado, at the State University of New York, Oswego. She teaches transitional memoirs, fiction, and visual art connected to immigrant experiences, including contemporary Southern African and South Asian work. Her publications explore the nexus between literature, photography, and the transitional and transhistorical implications of surveillance, colonialism, and apartheid on migratory bodies. She is a senior editor and writer at Africa is a Country, another standard by which writers live by these days. So the conversation today is to do with these two speakers' reflections and impressions of the exhibition, this grand exhibition that has toured, I think, in Milan, in New York, and in Munich, Germany, and now is here at home in Johannesburg. As I was writing about the exhibition a couple of times for the newspaper that pays my bills, have found it a bit troubling, to confront these images. I found, in a way, as Susan Sontag perhaps, as alluded to, the idea that photographs may shock because some of the images captured in the exhibition come as, shocking evidence of a time past. But I was not sure whether they move me to a place where I understand what happened. So they live as evidence, or at least as nice little spectacles, or evidence of a particular spectacle that happened. So, you know, I mean, Sontag wrote about how photographs of suffering and martyrdom of a people are more than reminders of death, of failure, of victimization, but the fact that they invoke the miracle of survival. So we understand that South Africans post-1994, post the official ending of apartheid, have survived something. And then we had a situation like Marikana that, you know, pointed us towards a particular woundedness, you know, and perhaps maybe we are still surviving or attempting to survive. So, I mean, I went into this exhibition and I came out with more questions than answers. And so I was glad when I was told these two will grapple with these issues and then more. So better them than me. But without much further ado, as the phrase says, I want to give you guys to the two. But here's a bit of rules of how this engagement is going to happen. I'm going to allow this to be a very informal conversation. Perhaps without the formalities, truth is allowed to breathe and can come out, whatever our idea of truth is. So Neelika will speak, and then good old David will speak. And then in that conversation, if you feel that you have something to contribute or a question to ask, you can raise your hand, and the bearded man with the funny head will acknowledge you. And then there are two interesting people at the back who will bring microphones to you. The lovely lady who just waved her hand at the back there, and the, can I say lovely? Yes. Gentleman with the blue jacket will bring a mic to you, and then we'll have it in that informal way. So, welcome.
Good evening, everybody, and I too want to thank City Press and the partners of the exhibition. And I know Leslie has told me she doesn't want to be thanked, she doesn't need to be, this is her job, but really without her and being on Twitter, I wouldn't have ever made this happen. So I'm very grateful to her, as well as to David, for making the time. He's generously given me many hours of his time over the past 8 years, perhaps, meticulously going through his work, page by page, telling stories of the people and structures he's photographed. Almost 15 years ago, I saw his photographs in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, at the Netherlands Architecture Institute. They were small and unobtrusive. I stood before them and found myself very moved. In fact, I think I cried. All I can say is that it was the first moment in which, after over a decade of leaving my own childhood home in Zambia, with only an understanding that it was not a location that had a place for me, I realized that it was possible to negotiate a relationship with a place that had little patience for the nuances of difference. At the time, I was living in the plains lands leading up to the Rocky Mountains of the US. It was a place of my spiritual affliction, I must say. I was hiding out. And in the Netherlands, when I saw Goldblatt's images, they held a history with which I didn't yet have the courage to engage. His photographs showed me that it might be possible to begin a conversation with one's history, as impossible and displacing as it will be. As much as I learned about the story of South Africa through literature, theory, history, books, conversations, Goldblatt's work and later others' photographs were my real entry. In a way, I could not have written any of my scholarship or any of the journalism that I do on Africa as a country without conversing first with David's photographs. I saw the Rise and Fall of Apartheid exhibition in Manhattan last year, and it was around Christmas, and the mega billboards of Times Square were what really captured people's eye. That and The Lion King, which was playing in a theatre next door to the International Centre for Photography. That's how Americans really know about Africa. Inside, there were not many people, and that gave me a chance to speak to the museum guards, a couple of students whose professors had told them to come. Undoubtedly, the ways in which New Yorkers encountered these photographs and this story were very different from the one you've experienced. When New Yorkers first walked in, the first blown-up poster they got to see was that of the women of the black sash protesting, which I fear may have given them an erroneous impression of what protest marches were like and who protested. I spoke to Camille Ortiz, the public relations coordinator at the ICP. She remembered only that as an American growing up, the system of apartheid was not something she was really taught. So the connections between Americans' experiences and those of South Africans remained in her peripheral knowledge. The museum guards I spoke to were a bit skeptical. High school students come, but they're just horsing around here yesterday, one lamented. I spoke to another guard patrolling the basement exhibition space. He turned out to be a Ghanaian. When I asked, when he learned that I teach at a university, he told me that he too is a teacher, or he was a teacher before he came to the US, back in Ghana. He had a Bachelor of Science in Social Studies and taught his students about the history of apartheid. He gave me a lesson right there. He told me that there was an initiative under Nkrumah when Ghana, Nigeria, and several other English-speaking West African countries adopted young South African children who had lost their parents and educated them free of charge. Then another museum guard, a stately gentleman with a crop of white hair rivaling Soyinka's unruly mob, who was from Jamaica, he told me that many South Africans did indeed visit the show in New York. But when he asked the South African-born visitors if anything had changed in their country, they told him that it had not. I was heartened to hear that Museum Africa went to great lengths to get people from a different demographic here, from the usual museum goer, working class people in inner city Joburg, that you sent people with flyers to high traffic zones such as taxi ranks to invite commuters to come here to the exhibition with their families and friends. From the opening night on 13 February until the 28th of February, more than 2,300 visitors were registered, and the number of visitors per day increased to 170 per day. People have come and recognized family members and friends in these photographs. In a way, this exhibition has recaptured what this building was originally intended for. It's become a marketplace, a meeting ground. Only now we meet to exchange thoughts, ideas, and haggle over who gets to tell the story. As anyone who has walked through this exhibition can tell you, it's an overwhelming experience. In fact, people might even feel that it's too much to attempt to visually narrate the traumatic history of apartheid, even though there are so many images and so many films. In fact, more than 800 photographs, 24 films and videos, artworks, documents, posters, periodicals, and the like. What I realized after my hours through the panels of photographs on 2 floors of the International Center for Photography in New York and here was that it's just the beginning of a conversation with a large extended family of images and image makers. It's like being invited to one's family reunion. Everyone is here, telling their story, speaking their presence, and people are bound to have some disagreements and arguments. After all, apartheid was an attempt to tell a singular narrative. Inevitably, that overarching narrative has to be contested. Here, in those contested narratives, those contested narratives via a collection of moments and experiences converge in one exhibition space. Despite that, certain viewpoints are bound to feel that they were edged out and that the dialogue is limited. And so we're hoping today we'll address some of those things that one might feel were left out. So one of the first things that I thought of asking you is about the title itself, Rise and Fall of Apartheid, and if that might erroneously bracket apartheid to a period that's really not left us yet.
To me, the exhibition has been wrongly titled. In my opinion, it should have been called Photography in the Rise and Fall of Apartheid. That would make clear that the exhibition has a very strong bias and it's built around a central idea, and that is the coverage of apartheid and its rise and fall through photography. Mm-hmm. The photography element is very powerfully given to us. I haven't seen anything like this in this country since the early 50s, when the American government brought out, or the Museum of Modern Art might have done it, the Family of Man exhibition,
Right.
which was a very extensive exhibition that had a very great influence, even though it's become somewhat disreputable now. I don't think it's possible to present the rise and the fall of apartheid purely in photographs in a meaningful way. I think that the attempt that has been made here is both very brave and very well thought through, but it is an attempt that has a particular emphasis, and that is the photography, which certainly I don't object to, but the limitations need to be borne in mind. The book that's accompanied this exhibition, in my opinion, gives a much better understanding, if you like, of the rise and fall of apartheid. It has more to do with that, but it is again heavily biased towards discussing the photographs. And I think it does this very, very well. There are some excellent essays. I think Okwi Nwizo's introduction to it is excellent. It's a very well considered and quite provocative piece of writing. And there are others, and Rory Bestra, who was the co-curator for this exhibition, has written a very interesting piece. So it's quite a complex package that we're looking at here. And I think it can be criticized for all sorts of reasons. There are some giant omissions in the way of coverage. There are omissions in the way of inclusion of photographers who might perhaps have contributed other ways of approaching the subject. But on the whole, I think it is, if I can put it in a nutshell, it's a magnificent achievement. And I find myself being very grateful to the ICP and its sponsors and the people who have joined it in putting this exhibition together, because it has really brought together a great deal of the culture of this country in one room, as it were. And that's quite an achievement when you think of the complexities of the country. But yeah, there's a great deal more to be said.
What do you think were some of the omissions? And that's not to...
Well, for example, I mean, I think that we have about 1 million so-called surplus people in this country. Farm workers who the farmers found to be surplus to their requirements. We had black spots, these were black-owned farms, which were ruthlessly uprooted because they were surrounded by white farms, and the people sent off to so-called closer settlement camps, often in the bush, where they had no chance of giving grazing, of grazing or of agriculture. I don't think that those aspects of apartheid have been given sufficient attention. But really, this is a matter of emphasis and of nuance. I think, perhaps I'm wrong, that the editors, if that's what you call them, or the people who put it together, might have benefited from a greater consultation with historians. I took another walk through today just to refresh my memory, and I don't think sufficient attention has been given to the group areas uprootings. The madness of it, the insanity of that in our society. And then there is the inevitable question, which we will probably not solve in the next century, and that is the manner in which apartheid as an ideology and as a whole system of thought and law has rooted itself in our innermost parts. It penetrated every single aspect of our society. Nothing at all ever escaped it. From scientific research through to the crudities of the Immorality Act, there is nothing that escaped it. And although we no longer have the formal machinery of that ideology, it has actually succeeded only too well. Verwoerd must be laughing in his grave, because we are as conscious today of our differences as we ever were in the system in which they try to set up. It will take us many generations, I think, to arrive at a situation where we're not a rainbow nation. Forgive me for being technical, but the rainbow is exactly what we don't want to be. In the rainbow, you split the spectrum. You split up light into its component parts. We don't want to be that. We want to be a melange, an indecipherable group of people. And it will take us a very long time to reach that stage. We are making great strides, and I think there's a lot to be grateful for, and to be even self-congratulatory, because we didn't have a civil war here. But there's the burden of what they set in place will be with us for many years.
Yeah, and having been born in an island where we have solved everything either. So it's not that having a civil war would have liberated South Africans from the burden of what they have to deal with today. But back to, really, to your photographs, I think the second exhibition that I saw, or show that I saw at Michael Stevenson Gallery, back when it was still up in Greenpoint, was when you had done 10 years of democracy show. I don't know what it was called anymore, but it had I remember it very well, because I went through an artist walkabout with you.
Was it a colour?
Yes, it was in colour,
yes, right.
with those very sort of bleached colours. And at that time, in the conversation that you had with the people who walked with you, it seemed a very different sort of atmosphere in the country, and forgive me if I'm wrong, I got a different sort of feeling from you also about your imagined hopes, perhaps projected hopes for the country, and it's a very different feeling now. And so I wanted to ask you about some of that, because I'd seen this photographs of structures for of the book of photographs that you have of structures, and it struck me that a lot of that is missing, despite the secondary title of this exhibition, which is the bureaucratization of everyday. I don't see a lot of bureaucratization in the exhibition, but I do see moments and protest. But as you say, it's the bureaucracy and it's the structures through which apartheid still survives very well. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit about what your fascination has revealed to you about those structures.
Well, I think that it is true that the exhibition that we've got here doesn't give much or any attention, in fact, to something that has preoccupied me for a very long time. But that's really by the by. It's not, I don't think it's central. I became obsessed, and I'm still obsessed with the structures that we've made that express our ethos, our values. And that's beginning to emerge, and this is where I spend most of my time now, photographing these things. But I do think that in the exhibition that we have here, there is a great deal that comes through of the bureaucratization. It comes through in the pass raids, it comes through in the manner in which officials dealt with us, with the people of South Africa. It comes through, perhaps not sufficiently, in the way in which, the many ways in which black lives were regimented. And here I include all who were not white. it was incredible. It was incredible. If you read a group area's proclamation, it's so insane that you cannot believe that it was actually done. But I spoke to a man who actually wrote one of those things, and that was his life. He did it. That was bureaucracy. And I think that, again, this is not by way of criticism of the editors of this exhibition. I think that could have been brought more forcefully to the front, because those things were so evocative. It wasn't just the apartheid signs, those were obvious. Every photographer who flew in here from the United States or Germany or France, that was where they headed first. That was obvious. There was much, much more, and it was much deeper, if you like, in the evil logic of it. I can only put it that way.
Right, and the fears behind that of
yes.
the logic,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
You've spoken about how you're interested in your photographs exploring the values, or our values. What can you speak a little bit about what you think of as our values, or what South Africa's values are?
Values, it's very easy to throw the terms around, but in our simplest actions we express values. You'll forgive me if I hold you up as an example. You've come tonight looking very beautiful in a lovely sari. I've come tonight in my best pants.
I can see that.
and my newest sweater, it doesn't have any holes. So we're each expressing values in this. And as basic as that is, that magnified by millions and millions and millions is what a society consists of, a human society. So let me not for the moment try to talk about post-apartheid South Africa, but apartheid South Africa was an extraordinarily rich soup of values. Because first of all, you had this overarching ideology, philosophy, with its huge armory of laws, and each of those expressed values. And the manner in which they did that was such that it influenced the manner in which we all had to behave. And try as we would, we were, for example, I'm just thinking of examples of this, we were, for example, precluded from experiencing each other's lives in an innocent and ordinary way. It required a deliberate attempt, if you were a parent, to get your children to meet with children of other races. Because they didn't meet them at school, that's for sure. They didn't meet them until much later in the game, as it were, on the sports field. We didn't experience each other's lives. So very few white people, to my knowledge, in Johannesburg had ever been into a black person's house. Whereas black people, of course, had been into many white homes.
Yes.
So these things set up a whole universe of values and distorted values, peculiar values. I'm sure in this audience here there are any number of examples that could be told to us of our values. And then you go to things, you go to religion. And religion was a very important component of our society, particularly then. On the one hand, you had the Afrikaner Protestant churches, which on the whole, except for some very important exceptions, were not just sympathetic to the apartheid ideology, but were complicit in a very active way in it. They expressed those values very powerfully, and I could enlarge on my theory of Dutch Reformed Church architecture, but I'll spare you that. But the values of the folk at various points in their political fortunes can be plotted against their architecture, the architecture of the churches. Until eventually, if you allow me just to say the one thing, in the 70s and 80s, the churches that were being built in the Afrikaner Protestant churches had very few piercings in their outer walls. This was the time of the total onslaught, when, according to P.V. Botha, we were threatened by communism, humanism, liberalism, socialism, every kind of liberalism that you can think of. And the churches were built very deliberately in this way, with very few piercings in the outer walls. When I spoke to architects of those churches, they gave me very rational reasons for this, because you had a better way of controlling the climate within the church. You could control the light so that it wasn't so harsh. You could control climate so that in the summer it was cooler, in the winter it was not so expensive to heat. This as against the earlier Dutch Reformed churches of the time, which had huge windows. But there was a liturgical and political aspect to that that's not sufficiently ventilated, in my opinion. Die woord moet uitgaan is the liturgical principle of the church. And allowing the word to go out, the word of God to go out, you had to have the preacher, the domine, at the apex of the megaphone, and the megaphone went out like that, and at the head of the megaphone were windows, big windows, so that the word could go out to the world. But in the 70s and the 80s, the word went out to the folk in the lager. So the value systems that were built were very interesting and very complex.
Right. In fact, the first photograph of yours that I ever saw was in a very little village in Holland, where I had a former partner from Holland, and his mother gave me the newspaper of the village with saying the Blank Architecture Institute is doing, oh, look at this photograph of David Goldblatt, and it was of a Dutch Reformed church that's in the shape of a rondevel. And do you know that photograph? And it has a spire, a very stylized spire going up. And we couldn't believe this was a church, because we just went to their 13th century church, and in fact their family was laughing at them for moving to the village over, because their family their home was in the 11th century church, and this was the new church with its rubbish new architecture. And there we were looking at your church, and we couldn't believe this could be a church. And so we were discussing, how can this be a church? Because it sort of looked like the prow of a ship. And I explained to them, oh, maybe they're trying to do it in the African style, in a maybe they're trying to be Africanized. And Lars, my boyfriend, was like, no, this is not trying to be any kind of anything. And then we were laughing about this because indeed the windows were like little slits, like in a warship, you know, where you just have a tiny slit to sling arrows out. And so this is what I got out of what that church was about. It is not about communing with each other, but the each other is a very small group. Yeah. So what I also see from the photographs here is that there are remarkably different values that are being shown by the different photographers. In fact, I spoke to a young woman while we were walking around, and I told her I'm going to pick on her, but because she said, the only one, you know, I haven't seen many of these photographs, and for that I'm really grateful to the ICP and the organizers, because there's so many photographers whose work I'd never seen and in fact never heard of before. So many New Yorkers were introduced to photographers that we had never heard of before, and in images that we'd never seen before, ever. But there was a set of photographs of what looks like very decadent behavior. Do you know what I'm talking about if you've walked around here? There's breasts exposed, there's drinking, there's carousing, and that's not a value system that we are speaking about. That's the other side repression, of course. And so it seems like it's a country where photographers, if they were going to photograph values, they were very in very separated sets of values. And that really comes through in this exhibition.
Yeah. The other aspect of religion, what you're talking about, that is on the other side, and that is that I think the fall of apartheid would have taken much longer had the Anglican and some part of the Catholic Church and the Methodist Church not been so supportive of the liberation forces and the opposition to apartheid. The UDF, in the UDF, there were many organizations that derived from those churches. And I have to say that this is a field for a discussion in itself. I mean, Bertrand Russell wrote his famous book, Why I Am Not a Christian. And there's a great deal in it that I find myself agreeing with. But on the other hand, I have to acknowledge that but for those churches, but for Desmond Tutu, Hurley and others, the overthrow of apartheid would have taken a great deal longer, in my opinion.
Percy, if you want to turn questions to the audience, or should we?
Yeah, I mean, the idea was that people are going to be vibrant and defying and defying the winter, you know. We were going to have fun. But I think, I mean, they were happy to sit at you guys' feet and sort of indulge. But yeah, any questions or comments? Okay, we have. Where are my guys? We have one here. We have one here and one there. All right. So we'll start here because the mic is still going that side.
I want to also ask you to think about photographers today and who's taking photographs of all the dangerous subjects that are we now like just lying down and not being engaged as we once were, or are we still engaging as we always have in South Africa? Because I just saw Niren Tulsi's photographs together with the writer how do you say his name? Goethe?
Oh yeah, he's here.
Is he here? Well, hi Niren. Well, I really admire those photographs because it takes a great deal of engagement to be able to take photographs like that. So when, you know, people say, well, we're not engaged anymore as we used to be, and I look at your photographs, I know that can't be true, and we must give thanks to the people who do fine work like that. So that's just a small side note, but I want to kind of ask you about what you all know about political engagement and photography today, because it's not just in the past. We have that tradition, and that tradition has given life to a younger generation who are still carrying on that work.
Yeah, we've had a voice here that's coming, and then we're going to go there, and then I'll take more hands as we go on. And then another one's there, so it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, just like that, lucky square number.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up what David said earlier about perhaps not reflecting enough of the black spot and removal situations, to say that in this completely overwhelming exhibition, the set of pictures of yours, David, about the Ndebele transportation, I think deserved a much greater accompanying context for people to understand just what that transportation really meant to people's lives. I thought, I read them, I read the captions, I don't think it's the first time I've seen them, and I thought, and Elizabeth and I discussed how it must have been, not just to take that journey one way, but to take it two ways. What sort of a life did that leave anybody to leave? And I thought the way you captured them, and the very small captions, deserved a much greater context, and I think it's possibly one of the problems or criticisms of this exhibition, that there needs to be more context for people who didn't know about or experience what is portrayed, for them to be able to understand just what this meant. Thank you.
I think that the organisers, the editors, compilers could be criticised perhaps for not giving sufficient critical background information at certain points in the exhibition, so that when you walk through it, you're taken, as it were, on a trip. At the moment, I found it, frankly, a little bit confusing. I walked in this morning and I'm faced with a choice of go to the right, go to the left, look here, look there. There is very little guidance. In a way, that's good, but in a way, I think that's disadvantageous, particularly to people who are not familiar with the territory. I accept that. And it's not particularly that set of photographs of mine. I would generalize a little and say that it's applicable to the way the visual map of the exhibition is constructed.
Yeah, I think that particular point you made, we were talking about it too, because of the fact that the captions, especially to a non-South African audience, say in New Yorkers or people in Munich, certainly wouldn't have understood that what it meant to put 3 hours of your life into a bus like that and then get up in the morning by 5 to get on or was it 4 o'clock you said? Like 3 o'clock to nod off to sleep while you're on a bus, to go and do hard labour. I don't think that context is really present, and I think when I teach my students and I show these photographs of yours in concert with the literature that they're reading, those are the photographs, and that story is what really gets them transported to that context. So missing that is problematic, I would agree.
But it's, you know, organising an exhibition of this magnitude, with this number of pieces, is quite a
feat.
Quite a feat, yeah.
Good evening. I think, you know, for myself, I've been fortunate enough to have been in high school at a time when the history of South Africa during apartheid was taught. But now when I was here and I was reading through the visitor's book, just, you know, reading through some of the comments of the exhibition, then I saw one comment where somebody says that, you know, he really feels apartheid was justified in trying to bring some order to a highly moral group of people. And then I thought about, you know, that in all what we've managed to document over the years is that I feel like we're missing. Sorry, I'm trying to read my notes on that.
Did you say that apartheid brought order to a highly moral group?
Highly immoral group of people. This was the comment.
Okay.
So, you know, what I thought that there's a gap for us to start to document is how some of the agents of furthering apartheid actually assisted in breaking down some of the values that might have been there in certain groups of people. Like, for example, if you think about the migrant labor system that happened to take away parts of families and move them all around and so on. You look at some of the outlawing of certain black businesses. Like, you look at a simple drink like Lekgetho, which is made from white meal. And that had to be taken away from communities and actually outlawed. I didn't know this, and my parents actually gave us some of this history that was outlawed. And umqombothi, which is sorghum beer, and those kinds of things. And then they were brought in to be sold to black people in the form of cartons, you know, chibuku, which is and machel, which now you buy in a carton, which is now, you know, convenience. But in that time, instead of formalizing black businesses that made those things, we took, you know, it was taken away and then brought in a different way. So I think if we actually tried to document some of those and actually go back to why those groups of people would be seen as having been immoral and needing to be controlled and so on, because some of those controls actually broke down that in any given situation you'd be finding yourself being against the law. That even if you worked for a seamstress, for example, by making clothes in the township, you're now stealing time rather than learning how to start your own business and doing those things. So I think that there's a lot of that we don't go into, of how the systems that furthered apartheid actually led to the breakdown of the moral fiber of certain groups.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's another hand there. Should we just wrap them up?
It's funny how when you talk about that, like, because I've lived in some other countries and my parents came from this island which was controlled by the British and before that by the Dutch and by the Portuguese. They did the same kind of system. So as a person who studies colonialism and apartheid on the body, the control begins with illegalizing your customs that are already in place to contain people, you know? Like all sorts of morality laws that we have as customs are about kind of containment in a way. But when an outside group comes in and tries to sort of make you uncivil, to create a barbaric creature out of you, first they take away what made you civil within your own customs, and then imposes a new system which allows them to sort of re-enter those same things in a way that now you almost are abusing that thing. Like, okay, we had beer, and now beer is only allowed underground, and now you become, of course, you become like this illegal person. And so it's a really deeply uncivilizing act. And we, indeed, like, that's the story of the British in Sri Lanka and India too, is that we are just a wild island lot who cannot hold a drink, and only certain people who can, you know, pass the liquor on. And when I read about South Africa, and even Zambia, which is, you know, didn't have the same kind of history, it's the same story. So it's like people know how to make you so demoralized that you yourself impose that feeling of incivility inside yourself.
Yep, there's another.
I was actually going to make the exact same point. I just had different examples and different references for it. And my sense, and the one thing that I didn't get from the exhibition, is the sense of the criminalization of black life. That living every day, going to work, raising your children, making a living, was made criminal because of the structures that existed to police that. And I think we've gotten very good examples here. And one of the things is also then continued into the struggle against apartheid, which made people make very difficult moral choices and enforced whatever values people had. There were a lot of choices that had to be made to struggle against this immoral system. And the idea of apartheid as a fundamentally immoral system, I don't think comes through strongly enough in the exhibition. You've got these vignettes, you know, of the signs, there's the comments that you see of people justifying apartheid, but you don't get the fundamental sense that it was immoral, it was wrong, it was as uncivilizing for the people that perpetrated it as it was for the people that were oppressed by it. And I don't think that comes through sufficiently enough, and I think that's a pity. And the reason why I think it's important to bring that through is that those structures, talking about the structures that continue today, the idea of the immoral black mass, the immoral black man, the harlot black woman, continue in our narratives today. And so much of the way that you hear corruption reported on is very much continuing the narratives that were born well before apartheid, but definitely institutionalized in a certain way and apartheid. And I think that it's a pity that there's some of that narrative that's lost in, that doesn't come through forcefully enough. I think because there's no narrative that brings the photos together. The photographs themselves are incredibly powerful, but like the first commenter said, if there'd been a bit more effort at a narrative, I think it would have been well.
Yep, any more hands? Any more hands? Any more? Okay, we've got someone at the back here, then you, and then someone at the back. Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Goldblatt. It was very interesting. We had this whole conversation about the religion, and you went into the architecture and the structure of the church, and very interesting, because I could always spot an NG Kerk, or they have foranders, or whatever it is. But it's very interesting, you spend a lot of time with the NG Kerk. Is there something about the Jewish mosques, and something about the temples? Because
temple, yeah?
Oh, the Jewish shuls, is that what they call? I might be risk of assuming that you're Jewish. I'm sorry for that, but it would be very interesting to see about that. Because in the story of apartheid, there's this whole, we don't talk about the Afrikaner and then perhaps the English, but then we don't talk about the Indian community who, once this writer said, beautifully says, they were great activists, but they're people who thrived within the system. And of course the Jewish people who made heaps of cash, as they continue to do, who they thrived in that system too. And does that filter down into the thing about structure?
I like your performativity.
With the jazz hands
I certainly did investigate the architecture of the shul, of the synagogue. I've also tried to investigate, to some degree, that of the mosques. And these are very interesting aspects of this society. Jews, on the whole, have adapted their places of worship to the places in which they've lived. And the architecture of the synagogues reflect this very strongly. If you go to Italy, you go to Florence, you go to the old synagogue there, it's quite obviously Italian. In Johannesburg, or in South Africa, if you travel around South Africa, you would find very many versions of the synagogue. And basically, these are adaptations by Jews to the circumstances in which they lived. As to making heaps of money, I would not deny that they did, but there were very many Jews in the liberation movement. The mosques in this country are a particularly interesting phenomenon in the sense that the apartheid government never touched a mosque. They never ever touched a mosque. And a mosque, once it's built, is on consecrated ground. So the Nats appeared to be so deeply religious that they respected the religious precept of the other's church, the mosque, and never interfered with it. The more, forgive the Afrikaans, the more harde explanation that was given to me by some people was that South Africa was doing a deal with the Saudi Arabians for oil. And they said, on the one hand, we will not touch the mosques, you give us oil. So where the truth lies, I was never able to find out, I'm afraid. There are PhDs still to be done in this country. And in the case of the English, let's call them the English churches, the Methodists, the Catholics and the Anglicans, on the whole, the smaller churches didn't rock the boat. This was the pervading ideological position of the middle church, if I can put it that way. Not of many of the church men, not of Beyers Nordier, for example, not of Tutu, not of Hurley, and many others, and many village priests. They were absolutely opposed in every sense to the apartheid regime. But the pervading value, if you like, if I can revert to that, in many of the village churches was, don't rock the boat. So in order not to rock the boat, you didn't build a big church with a high spire. That would rock the boat. The Afrikaners, on the other hand, wanted to rock the boat. This was the very difference between the energy, if you like, of the Afrikaner Protestant churches and the others.
I'm very interested to hear from any of you about how South African Indians managed with apartheid, between apartheid and their belief systems. Because, I mean, since my family is actually Buddhist from the island of Sri Lanka, so I don't really, I mean, there's many Hindus in Sri Lanka, but I don't really, haven't really read up on how that was negotiated, though I do know, again, like David, many Indians were activists, gave their lives for the struggle, but it doesn't mean that people don't find ways of being complicit to survive, because in fact my experience is that mostly we do stay complicit in order to survive, because you want your child to go to school, you want a future for them that's different. When I think of like what happened after 9/11, a passport wouldn't be, you know, so we complied. And until they saw my name on the passport, I was, you know, Mexican chica. So, and I didn't look dangerous because, you know, my ass was in tight jeans. So I thought that that's funny how, like, we become complicit in order to stay safe, in order to avoid harassment, even on these small scales, right? I didn't do anything awful, but at the same time, I wasn't really, I wasn't interested in, like, making the authorities give them a chance to harass me. So I know that that's what the ordinary person usually does. And I would agree with you that most people probably kept to themselves as much as they could.
Yeah. I'm going to throw a thought out that will quite possibly land me in trouble here tonight, and that is, we were all complicit except for those who were prepared to risk their lives. And I include the black people of South Africa, until the students in Soweto came out in revolt in 1976. We were not prepared to risk our lives, which is what it entailed. And my experience in Soweto in the 1970s, when I did a lot of photography there, was that people wanted to get on with their lives. It was a desperate need. They wanted to pay the rent, they wanted to buy their kids school uniforms and see them well educated. And these values were predominant. It required an enormous act of courage for somebody living in Soweto to join the underground.
Hello. Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment about Indians. I just finished working on, well, not just finished, a few years ago, finished a documentary on Indians in the 1950s. A comment about Indians thriving in apartheid. And I think what's quite interesting is you know, we looked at a lot of photographs by Ranjit and Kali and G.R. Naidu from drum era. And what they document is not a kind of a thriving Indian, but Indians who are quite impoverished in a number of ghettos, and also on sort of plantations. And I think just one small fact that I found quite interesting was in the 1950s there was only one high school for Indian boys in Durban, and hundreds of boys would compete to enter into that school, and if you didn't make it, you would get in. So a lot of schools that were actually built in Indian areas were done through community activism, self-help. So I just think we should be careful of thinking that. I mean, you just need to go to Chatsworth, Phoenix, or those places to know that these are still largely working-class communities, people who haven't thrived or benefited in any huge way from apartheid. I think we've got to be careful of suggesting that they thrived.
For me, this body of work, to some extent, is a visual reality of the dire situation that South Africa is in currently, as far as racial discourse, or you may call it racial mistrust. Because I mean, in my mind is that I keep asking myself a question, that we always talk about reconciliation, we always talk about social justice, but the question that remains in my head is, where are the white South Africans? Because currently, black South Africans are always on the receiving end. So they're the ones that are always forgiving. They're the ones that are always willing to forgive. And I would ask myself, so who are they reconciling with? How do we bring back, white South Africans? Because the reality is, we currently, as South Africans, we are not speaking to each other. We are speaking across one another, and the dialogue has not started. And my question is then, how do we invite, white South Africans to acknowledge privilege, to acknowledge that there's many other histories that happened before the apartheid system, because I think the apartheid system was the, we know it was one of the most cruel systems that, was ever, practiced. In fact, I think the Afrikaners, they mastered a form of architecture which they did not create, but they mastered it better. And by the time it came, I think black South Africans were so tired that they didn't know, as it was said earlier, that people just wanted to get on with their lives. And I think because of that, people were just tired. And now that we have democracy, we have freedom, still there's no engagement, and just black people say, okay, fine, it's fine, let's get on. But I don't find the other, wanting to be there and engage so that we can be able to move on, and we can be able to say, okay, fine, we are free, we are this one united society. And I think we're not going to be that society up until the other is willing to sit down and talk.
Let's have you quickly and then we'll do the responses.
Good evening. I would have liked to see a lot more on the systems that apartheid introduced to people of color to break them apart from one another. The tripartite alliance is one of the...
Tricameral.
Tricameral.
You're young.
The tricameral alliance was one that, not the tripartite government.
System, let's say justice.
Yes, that was one that...
System is the word that covers everything.
Anyway,
that for
please
me
ask.
stands out the most as breaking apart people of color within different races. So now we have all this bickering of who's really black and who's African and who should get BEE advantages, and we have all of this, the Indians were prosperous and the coloreds were, but we don't realize how integral apartheid was in shifting the paradigm of people of color unified versus people of color casting doubt upon one another based on differences that were taught to us by someone who is a complete third party. So I would have liked to see a lot more of that.
I think that's a justifiable comment.
I just think that the discussion here has been very fascinating, but it underlines the problem about representation and history that this exhibition has. One of the things, I want to change the discussion slightly, but one of the things that worried me about this exhibition is that it denies history, in the sense that it denies the photographic history, it denies who took pictures, when they were taken, what were the divisions, what were the intellectual debates that were taking place among photographers or writers or intellectuals in the country. So what you have is an intellectual project looking at apartheid, the rise and fall of apartheid, but it doesn't actually explain apartheid. It doesn't even explain the fact that all those photographers, many of those photographs are press photographs. And they were taken by people who were privileged. There were divisions, so there is no discussion about division. There is no discussion about class or color. It's this one narrative put into a very nice package, but it denies this intellectual debate that we've had in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, which was integral part of the liberation struggle, those debates, where we discussed and we began to engage with the notion of identity, of space that we created, of cultural practices, notwithstanding apartheid, which we were able to exercise. But so what you have here is an exhibition which tries to talk about an intellectual history of photography, but it does it, and it provides a one-sided view, largely a political response to apartheid. The demonstrations and things like that. So the editors actually bypass all those debates. Debates that we had, David, in the 80s when we put together the Cordant Heart. Cordant Heart began to explain apartheid in a different way, and other exhibitions that we put together. So you don't get a sense of apartheid. You get a sense of apartheid here in this exhibition as a response to the political repression, not to the social impact of apartheid.
Could I respond?
Or if it is, then it's a very small element. So there's two elements here. One is to try and explain apartheid, and the other one is to explain the role of the photographers. So you get the exhibition broken up into categories of struggle photographers and 40s drum photographers and things like that. So they've done us a disservice as editors in that they bypassed all those debates. They bypassed all the studies that had been done in the last decade about photography and complexity of photography. So that's one of my big criticism of the exhibition. The editors came and sat with some of us. They spent 10 minutes. They didn't question or discuss or interview. They just wanted pictures. And then they took those pictures and then they strung it together in a discourse that bypassed our own history and our own discourse. They denied us that intellectual history that we fought for, we defined, and we created a new language, a visual language in this country. So that visual language it doesn't exist there. It exists in sections. It's not put into any context at all. It's thrown into this 800 photographs with this thing about bureaucracy of everyday life. This doesn't make sense.
If I may try to respond to my good friend Batsha. I think in the exhibition itself it's very difficult to do this. If you look at the book there, it does precisely what you're talking about. There is quite a lot of discussion about the discussions that took place and about some of the divisions within the photographic community.
Involved in actually acting out apartheid. So when those moments that I'm talking about that people experience and describe, they're not always a police officer, it's not always a government official. It's your neighbor calling you something. It's someone walking in a shop and telling your father, a young man telling your father that he's not worth anything, or pushing him, or spitting on him. And those are the stories that people tell. And if we want to confront whiteness and white privilege in our country, we have to be able to admit that on a fundamental level, our parents sometimes were very bad people who were part of this bad thing called apartheid. And we mustn't carry on putting it on Afrikaners because it's not, and that's why I think there's a major defensiveness in the Afrikaans community sometimes, because it's just not valid. It's not a valid criticism that it's only Afrikaners that did this thing.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but you missed what I said. I said we were all complicit. There were varying degrees of complicity, if you like. Black people were complicit in the sense that they didn't take up arms and have a revolution. Most whites were complicit in the sense that we went along with the system. But that doesn't in any way change the fact that the core group of the originators of this policy were the Broederbond and the Afrikaner Protestant churches and their followers. I'm afraid this is the truth. They accumulated followers, active fellow travelers along the way. Jews, Greeks, Italians, English, a lot. But the core group, the energy, came from those groups. That's not to be denied.
I also think that we have varying levels of complicity depending on the level of threat to your life and livelihood, and because that we must remember that there's a greater danger for certain people than others. So we may be complicit, but the threat to life and well-being are greater for others than for some too. I know there's other questions, but I saw a gentleman in the front row shaking his head, but I really want to give you a chance to say something about it.
On the spot.
I'm sorry about loving, but I really want you to, because that's what this discussion is for. Otherwise, what we do is say what we want, and we really didn't have a dialogue there.
But I think I'm just uncomfortable with...
Do you want to speak up so that the guys at the back can hear you as well?
Yeah.
Sorry for messing the order up.
Yeah, you owe me a bit.
Your disconsolate head shaking, I saw it.
No, I wasn't going to say anything, but I think I'm just uncomfortable with the suggestion that we were all complicit. And I think it's sort of a characterization of an extreme, that you had to take up arms or else you were complicit. And I think it's a bit unfair in the sense that, you know, if you think of, for instance, of the notion of weapons of the weak, which suggests multiple forms of resistance, you know, and I think if we move from one extreme to another, we discount the everyday narrative, the daily realities of victims who would undertake various forms of resistance, and so I think it's just a bit unfair. So I'm not comfortable with that.
I said that I wasn't going to be pleased.
But David, one of the things I remember from that first show that I went to see in the Netherlands was that you had a remarkable photograph of a woman growing cabbages, and the caption underneath, and this is, you know, like back when I was in my 20s, so it was a very long time ago, but I remember what you said, that this is, in a way, this is her resistance. So she's growing cabbages, so she may not be out in the front, she may not be risking her life in quotes, but she's a domestic, she's raising cabbage so that her children can eat.
Yeah.
And that itself is a remarkable labor.
Yeah, look, I've deliberately put it in an extreme form, so as to, if you like, confront. But there can be no question that there were different degrees of complicity. So we whites we were neither whites nor blacks in a sense. We were grey, and the degree of greyness can be measured on a spectrum, in a spectrum. And this goes right through the society, and it made a huge difference where you were in that cosmic order, if you like. Yeah, I mean, this is an endless debate, but I think one must. It's not something that I accepted in my own mind for a long time. I didn't want to accept this, but it's true. The fact is that this wasn't a revolutionary society until the 1970s, when the kids in Soweto came out. And then it became, we almost had a full-scale revolution here in the 80s. When many people were prepared to show themselves and come out in one way or another in active opposition to the apartheid regime. Tens of thousands of young people were in prison without trial. They were beaten with sjambos and tortured, and not a few whites as well. So I'm with you completely. I understand that we're talking of shades of complicity here, but they were important in the scheme of things. I don't know what my friend Butcher would say.
You know, we took up arms in 1960.
Yeah.
76 is, you know, 3 decades down the line. And, you know, yes, people took up resistance. I joined when I was in high school, underground. But, you know, the question of complicity, and we must be careful about this. One of the things that made colonialism work and apartheid work was the role of the chiefs. We forget that. You know, we forget the fact that it was the Bantustan leaders that began fighting against us and unleashed one of the most horrific periods in our history. 22,000 people died in Natal, you know, because of Buthelezi. You know, so there is complicity, and it's not just black and white, you know, it's a whole range of things. But resistance takes different forms. You know, people protected and expressed themselves culturally in ways that were quite extraordinary. Some of us tried to capture that. Some of our writers did that brilliantly, you know, tried to bring out all of that. Our musicians and things like that. But those were, so the society, we were not all victims, you know. We were all out to liberate ourselves, not just as blacks, but as South Africans. And we must accept that, you know, that one of the things that the liberation struggle did was talked about a new South Africanism and tried to be inclusive. All right, we've lost it for the moment. At the moment we are in a crisis, but nevertheless, that vision still remains, you know. So I'm just saying, complicity, yes, but there was also agency in so many different ways. And it was not, as I say, during the period of the Transkei, for every 500 people, there was one civil servant, and he was black, or she was black. You know, so there were all of that nuances. So we must understand our history, and we must understand it carefully. One of the things that this exhibition does, it denies that history. It glorifies it in a way that it distorts our past. So that's why we can't understand what we are doing now. We're struggling with the notion. We don't even talk about socialism, we don't talk about capitalism, we don't talk about colonialism and its impact on us, you know. So this conversation is a good one. We should have more of it. In fact, it is happening. There is a lot of that, you know, this evening, the person on the radio talked, the economist talked about that the workers lost 50,000 rands, and they are only getting back 7,000 rands a month after the strike. And he thought this as an absurd thing, that these people could fight for that and lose so much. And, you know, and it was absurd for him. He didn't realize that those workers went on strike not just for the pay, but to try and change the system.
Which they've done.
Yeah.
Small point about complicity and non-complicity. Is it on? I was very interested and pleased and proud to see the prominence given to the black sash. These women were not complaining about their situation. They were very disturbed at the damage to the Constitution when the colored vote was removed. And their indignation continued for many years and voiced itself in very clear documentation of all the Group Areas Act removals. How many people from here and to where? They, in fact, made the most incredible map of where each family went. And I don't think there was anything else to compare with that. They went also far enough to create an advice office where anybody in despair because they were being moved out of town or put in jail wrongly or being interfered with in one way or another, those people went to the Black Sash. The long queues, every day, every week, were spoken to, sorted out by very ordinary housewives who were trying to think how these things could be improved, how people could be helped. The Black Sash Advice Office still exists. It was something that helped thousands and thousands of people. So I was glad to see these very ordinary white women, housewives, holding these banners. I think theirs were some of the early public protests. For some of them it was a very brave thing to do. And I was glad they were remembered. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, go.
I also want to speak about complicity. I didn't get to see much of the exhibition, but one of the pictures I did see was a big blown-up canvas with a poster saying "Stop Police Terror." And one of the things that struck me was like that is very relevant to our situation right now. Not specifically police terror, but I suppose terror from authority or from power. And looking at things like the killings in Marikana, and feeling that we are complicit after the fact for not speaking out, for not doing anything. And I think that people have, since we have some sort of democracy and rights, that people have become more complicit and more people are just getting on with their daily lives. Not that I can criticize people for doing that, but there are things like the killings in Marikana, school systems in the Eastern Cape, in Limpopo, Yalke, and all these things seem like arm's length because you either don't know any of the people that were killed, or you don't know the children in the mud schools, or you have private healthcare. But these are problems facing South Africans, our South African ones. And the thing is, you don't have to lay down your life or risk your life, but I think there needs to be, people need to find ways to hold government or people in power accountable for these things. It's not, you don't have to risk your life, but people do need to, more people do need to take an active role, not just pockets of social justice organization.
I think I'm probably going to follow up on her, but also to draw on a couple of other things that people have said. Perhaps starting with Neelika, your publication early on, just around sort of where are our photographers now, where are our writers now? And I was just considering that through the lens of what David has said previously, just around sort of, and which is very apparent in his work, just sort of around capturing struggle, resistance, documenting a particular history through the quiet spaces, not necessarily the noise. You know, and there's a lot of noise today, whether it's Twitter or Oscar Pistorius or sort of the media's crisis as sort of perhaps a debauching of a society or a democracy that maybe 10 years ago David was a lot more optimistic about, as you possibly observed. So just, yeah, your thoughts on that. And also, Paul's the photographer. I just put the words around his amazing photographs.
Right, this response is from you, and then responses from you, and then we...
Go ahead, David, please.
I don't really know what to say. I mean, there is an amazing amount of very fine photography coming out of this country.
Right.
And I think that there are some photographers who are very profoundly engaged, if you like, in trying to come to grips with the society. So in this respect, I think we're quite well served. I have to say, though, that there is a terrible gap in the knowledge of our history, and what is much more worrying, a lack of respect for what was done by people in the struggle. I've been doing photography lately that takes me to looking at memorials and monuments, and I can't tell you how many of these memorials to people who died in the struggle have been trashed. Not only the bronze plaques stolen, but the memorials themselves brutally trashed. And this to me is a reflection of the state of our economy to some degree. I think it must be quite difficult to respect this sort of thing if you don't have a job and you have no prospects and you're badly educated. But it's a sad reflection on our society.
On the other end of it, you know, from writing for Africa as a country and having worked with Sean Jacobs since he made it from his personal blog into a more public one, I am so honored to work with photographers and writers and thinkers that I am now, who are far younger than me, and to work with them on editing and get their comments and have their comments on mine, and to be challenged by the people that I'm working with now. And they are young people in their 20s, even in their teens, just coming to find a space in which they can voice some of those things that other venues don't allow them. I think that this country can be a very closed space full of, how do you say that? It can be very territorial, right? I found that. But luckily, I have other places where I can spread out where I want to be, so it doesn't matter if somebody rejects me or gives me a cold shoulder or says something like marginally rude that's underhanded. You know those comments, right? Yeah, I know them well. But I'm so happy for the fact that living outside the country, as I do and as Sean Jacobs does, that we've been able to create a space in which I'm so honored, that's what I have to say, that people are risking things in order to write some truths, to take some photographs that speak some truths too. So thank you, whoever is here, some of you are here.
Yep. All right, we come to the end of our proceedings, and I'd like to extend my gratitude to you both for allowing yourself the time to share with us, and also the lot of you who've come out during this cold evening to be here and not by the TV watching the World Cup.
I'm not missing.
All right, so go home, eat lots of chocolate, and keep reading the city press. Thank you.
Blow!